That's a very good question to ask, isn't it, Alison? I think it's both actually, and they both occur at the same time, or it does vary between the two. And I guess that's the best way of describing it: confused and frustrated. So he's first of all, he's hit the nail on the head by identifying that as the experience, really. And for me, at the stage I'm at, it's the frustration tends to be more noticeable to me than the confusion. I think the confusion sometimes is what other people detect more than the frustration. And the frustration can be manifested in anger, or it can be manifested in sadness and grief and depression. But the confusion is easier for other people to detect and to maybe relate to, because that's part of their understanding of what dementia is about. Whereas the frustration perhaps is rather less what the audience would expect. They would expect people with dementia to be confused. They would expect people with dementia to illustrate that memory is a problem for them. Where they might be slightly less, where they may be slightly more surprised, would be the frustration that comes with it, because that then is often manifested in the term challenging behaviour, which we all hate. But that's because of the frustration.
Yeah.
Yeah, really everything that Keith has said, all of the above. And it is, I think, where the term challenging behaviour comes in, because you're really frustrated with yourself. But then that can come out as if you're angry, as if you're maybe not necessarily being aggressive, but being, people would say it's over the top. Okay, she can't sort of do that. Why is she getting herself into such a state? So you're told you're being difficult or challenging. And, for myself, it would be, the day is the sort of confusion thing. But I agree with Keith, that's normally what other people would pick up. The frustration is sometimes just deep within and nobody else picks that up at all. But then I think the emotion sort of comes out, that there's something else that you've recognized that you can't do. And depending how important that has been sort of previously, how much that can affect you. There's some things you can easily sort of let go. Okay, I can't do that, that's fine. But there's other things that really emotionally affect you, and you can become quite depressed sort of about that, because you recognize that that's something else that has gone. But I say a really good question that he put to you, definitely.
Just a question which I'm interested to know. There's no mention of the word fear. Does fear come in anywhere in those emotions?
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't experienced it directly, only as an observation. Although as a carer, I think recognizing that, the situation has changed and dementia is on its way or developing, then I think there's an element of fear in the carers as well, certainly. Recognizing the implications, over the longer term.
Yeah, I totally agree. I used to see it with Mum. She'd get really quite frustrated that she couldn't do something. And if people tried to take over and help her, although she was aware that they were trying to help, she used to really get quite, I don't want to use the word belligerent, but that's how I think people would see her. But I just realized that was her saying, because she was very independent. She was very much, we were very alike. She would be very much, no, I can do it. And if someone tried to jump in and help her, she would really get quite frustrated with them and herself. But the other thing was, I think Keith mentioned it, grief. I could see that sometimes she used to say, I feel so helpless and hopeless, and I'm a waste of space. And she'd get quite upset about feeling that she wasn't any use anymore. So for me, it was a big thing of just buoying her up and making sure that we tried to avoid things she couldn't do and show her what she could.
Yeah, and so sometimes there is an element of humour in confusion. There's no element of humour in frustration. you can sometimes laugh at yourself, and you can laugh with someone else around a confusing incident or a confusing conversation, but there's very little humor in frustration. And again, that might be something that you could explore.
Yeah, I think before my diagnosis, before the doctor actually said the words, he had already I had already worked it out in my mind what was going to be said, but yet when they said it's still a big shock. And I really went into a very dark place, because all I could hear the doctor was say, you've got Alzheimer's, go and put your affairs in order. But there was no sort of hope being given. There was no sort of guidance as to who I could possibly contact. So for myself, I would describe it as I went into a really dark hole, and I came out of that doctor's surgery, the doctor's consultation room, relieved, probably in one sense to have it confirmed, but in another sense, terrified.
I wrote half a chapter in my book about this. And my story into diagnosis was very unique and different. I was 54 at the time, and I was presenting as a healthy 54-year-old head teacher of a big school. And I went to see the doctor because I was having balance and coordination problems as well as concentration, not memory. And to cut a long story short, they sent me for an MRI scan, wanting to rule out a brain tumor. And that came with an appointment with a neurologist. So the very first person who mentioned the word Alzheimer's to me wasn't the GP, and wasn't a psychologist, and wasn't a psychiatrist. It was a neurologist. And he explained to me the scans, and he drew for me, which was really helpful, what he considered to be a healthy 54-year-old brain. And he drew a sketch of my brain based on the scans, which were in front of both of us, because he could understand the scans and I couldn't. So to interpret them, he drew some sketches. And that was really, really helpful. And that was the first time the word Alzheimer's had been mentioned to me. So you could have knocked myself and my wife down with a feather. It was a complete and utter shock. But what you need to remember is that the process of getting a diagnosis is often quite protracted and quite lengthy. And it's not a case of going to the doctor and the doctor saying, you've got dementia, you've got Alzheimer's, as you would with some health conditions. It often involves quite a series of investigations. So in my case, the picture was built up between May and December. And all the time, each appointment, each assessment, it was another piece in the jigsaw. So you're building up a jigsaw picture with the person, so that when you come to that final appointment, which says, well, Mr. Oliver or Mr. Smith or Mr. Briggs or Mrs. Briggs or whatever, yes, the investigation is concluding that you have got dementia. It's not quite the shock that it otherwise would be. Because when it's first mentioned to you, that's where the shock really comes in. And so a lot of it depends upon, and you're taking on the role of the doctor, a lot depends upon that approach that the doctor develops with the patient, and the way that over time you build an understanding of the person who's sitting in front of you. Because some people, like me, will want the absolute facts and will want to know what we're confronting and what we're dealing with. Other people would need a much more subtle approach, possibly, and a much more gentler approach than what I wanted. I wanted the basic facts, so I knew I was contending with. And then from that, where do we go from here? Because we're all placed on that cliff edge when we're given the diagnosis, and we want to come off that cliff edge. And again, I think that's part of the role of the doctor, but sometimes they don't take that role on. And also, you'd also get occasions where characters like the one that Keith is playing would not know why they're seeing you. Why has my GP sent me to you? You know, so that's another area that you might want to sort of touch upon.
What Keith just said is, yeah, GPs don't like to talk about dementia very much. Even now, even 10 years on with Dementia Friendly, I still come across GPs who are a bit wary of talking about it. But I mean, our experience, I was living abroad and realised something's going on with Mum. I'd come back for a couple of weeks at just after Christmas, something going on, kept in touch with her, and then ended up coming back in the summer. I was living over in Asia and stayed with her for a little while and realised that something was really bad. I mean, I got a little job here just to keep myself going, and I'd come home and she'd put all my clothes either in the bin or up in the attic or pack them up because she thought I was still living abroad. People phoned up for me. She'd say, oh no, she's still in Korea. And she did actually at one point ring the police up because her car had gone missing. I got stopped because her car was reported stolen. Said, oh, I'm her daughter. And because she'd not long moved, things didn't tie up with the address that I thought she was at because she hadn't moved her car. And they phoned her up and said, well, we've got a lady that says she's her daughter. And she said, ridiculous, my daughter lives in Korea.
Oh,
so
no.
they brought me home, which was thought it was hysterical. My next door neighbour, who's a policeman, thought it was hysterical as well. But those sort of things were going on, so I knew something was wrong. She had a scan as I was preparing to move back, and the doctor said, well, there's nothing from the scan, so no, it's just a depression.
Wow.
We kind of knew it wasn't, so we fought and fought. But our big fear was my dad died of a brain tumour back in '82. We nursed him. That it was something like that. So again, people maybe will think it's something like that. Doctor still wouldn't, register it, and it was nearly 2 years. So she'd had the scan in the June, 2 years almost. It was in the May. We'd gone out, and she'd managed to have a skin tear on her leg, and we had to go down to the hospital to have it dressed. And I dropped her off. Sent her into A&E to get dressed, the wound dressed, went to park the car, and knowing what I know now, I'd said the fatal things of, I'm just going to go and park the car. So in her brain was car park. So she went out to try and find me in the car park because she wasn't sure why she was there. I meantime went in, and the receptionist wouldn't tell me if she'd gone in or not.
Oh.
So I was waiting in the waiting room when the security guard turned up with her, blood everywhere because it was now going through the temporary dressing. And she was very confused about why she was there. And because she got a wound, she couldn't explain, I couldn't explain. Oh, sorry, yeah, she did the wound before I'd met her. So it was really confusing about what was going on. And they thought it was abuse because she was very confused and we weren't talking about what was going on. And
Oh my goodness.
we're going to bring in social services. I just, at that point, was so relieved. So they checked back and looked in her records, different hospital. We were in Winchester, so Southampton Hospital, she had her scan, and found that actually she'd got vascular dementia. And bizarrely, because the way the system is, we weren't allowed to get the diagnosis at that point. We had to go to the GP on the Tuesday, and he was so brisk. I think probably because for 2 years he'd been telling me it's nothing, and now actually it was vascular dementia, and he just said, nothing we can do, that's what it is. I'm sorry. And just looked at me like, yeah, bye. And Mum looked at me, I looked at her, and we went outside, and it was just, well, what do we do now? And there was relief. It wasn't a brain tumour because we'd seen what that's like, but we didn't really know much about dementia. I kind of wondered if it was, but I didn't go that far down looking at it. And as Keith said, it's just that moment of you're not sure if you're relieved or shocked or what. But yeah, it can be quite an unpleasant situation.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is very common. I think if more doctors took the time to explain it the way it was explained to Keith, I think that would make a huge difference. Even 5 minutes to sit, explain, yes, the outcomes the same. There isn't anything they can do.
Mm.
But as I say, the only words I can remember is put your affairs in order. And that was it. Right, I've told you the diagnosis, on your way, no answers, no questions, or no sort of information given to sort of help. And I think what Keith described, that is perfect, but the way you're being asked to portray it unfortunately is the way for most people it will happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At best, it's a paternalistic approach, you know, not wanting to upset the person. At worst, it's a very disrespectful approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because what it does is it infantiles the patient or the person who's sitting in front of the doctor, thinking they can't cope with this, or I can't cope with the way I'm going to need to explain this to them. I guess my good fortune was that the neurologist recognised that, you know, I was in a position where that's what I wanted, and I could take what he was going to tell.
The conversation has gone on from where I was at slightly, but there is perhaps an interesting point here, and that is that I sat alongside my partner, who's most recently been diagnosed, and it was a lady GP and a lady client. And I was never quite sure whether the doctor just didn't want to tell her or whether she was playing the long game, because it was protracted, and they were careful. She was careful about the use of the language. And if my partner said, "Well, I don't think I've got dementia," she'd go along with that. But she still sent it to the memory clinic. There's a sense in which the doctor, the consultant or whatever, has to make a judgment about the person, don't they? And I think that's been mentioned as to whether they can cope with it. But at the same time, if they're sympathetic in that sense, and it suggests from what we've heard from the others that perhaps there are not so many sympathetic ones around, but that certainly at the end of the day, you know, my partner quite happily accepted it because they'd gone along this path together. Well, it's clearly not something as one character in your drama you're going to be able to portray that, I don't think, but I make the point anyway.
Just to get inside the head of the GP for the moment, I'm sure you've given a lot of thought to this, trying to, you know, get into their mindset and their way of thinking. I'm not defending them, but I guess there's a few issues really that need to be considered in portraying a GP in this situation. And one is, and I know GPs have told me this, if I give the person a diagnosis of dementia, or if I confirm a diagnosis of dementia, what support is there going to be for them? Yes. That's what what treatment, what support can they be given? Because if you go to a doctor for virtually all health conditions, they will be able to give you something. It might not cure it, it might not solve it, but invariably either it will help them, or you'll be able to signpost them to somebody who can help them, a specialist of some sort. In the case of dementia, there's not much in their armory really.
Yeah.
So you know, the GP has to really understand that relationship between him or her and the patient is going to be the lifeline for that patient.
Yes. Yes.
And the word discharge is mentioned at point of diagnosis to people. And you know, 99 times out of 100, if a medic says to you, "Well, Deborah or Kathy or Rachel, you know, that's it now, I'm going to discharge you," you go out and celebrate. But in the case of dementia, it's quite the reverse, because basically what it says is, "There's nothing I can do to help you."
Yes.
You know, so you know, that's something to consider. I think what is driving the GP into saying and thinking what he or she is saying is, I guess, the fact they feel there's nothing in their armory to help that person with.
Yes.
But there is really. What is in their armory is that person who is the GP.
The way I kind of processed it was, GPs now, if they're giving a diagnosis of cancer or so many other conditions, as Keith said, they've got this huge armory of things that they can do.
Yeah.
And so they must spend most of their day actually finding that, you know, things that, particularly as older, he is retired now, this GP, but, you know, when he started, cancer would have been the death sentence and that's it. And now, you know, you can give good news to so many people and see them come into remission, etc. and then he's got dementia, which seems to be increasing. And that's the one where, for, well, I think just about every dementia, there isn't much they can do. Vascular dementia, give them an aspirin, might thin the blood, it might help. And so, you know, this thing of, well, there's not a lot we can do. I wonder how much that is a reflection of how a GP feels absolutely, completely helpless in being able to help people. And it must be an awful, I mean, it must be awful to have to tell people that you've got this. And I don't think that many of them understand what there is out there. You know, all these, there are some wonderful groups that can, I mean, they can't stop it. They might be able to slow it, but what they can do, and I think Alison mentioned it right at the beginning, is give people hope that they might, the life isn't going to be the same, but at least it could be good.
Yeah.
It's not going to be as hopeless as you can feel, where you know, we've mentioned the word cliff, and I always say people fall off a cliff and they just lie there and wonder what they're going to do next. If we can sort of sweep them up and give them something that at least they've got some sort of life. And at some point, should I use Mum's quote now?
Oh, go on, do it. Yes.
Mum's famous quote she used when we were talking to Hampshire County Council about, and it's just what older people want out of life. And the strapline they used was, "There's no point in keeping us alive if we don't have hope." Sorry, if we don't have a life. So no point in keeping us alive if we don't have a life.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. Give people hope, and then they've got that they can have a bit of a life.
Yeah.
And she just went around terrorizing people. She had a great time. She used her dementia as an excuse to get away with all sorts.
The difference is that, of course, with doctors, if they're thinking entirely in terms of health and drugs and ameliorating the symptoms, then yes, there's very little they can do. But we can do a lot to change the experience of living with dementia and how people feel about it. And that's where things like, you know, the toolkit that these guys help develop, or activities, when they're the activities that somebody wants to do, can really come into play.
Not to keep saying, yeah, you've told me that, you've told me that, you've told me that.
Yeah.
Not
Because that's one of the most characteristic thing is that people will repeat, and you have to go along with it and just carry on the conversation as if it was a normal conversation. But you also have to adjust your behavior to fit in with their behavior. I mean, in a sense, they become the dominant person in how the relationship operates, because, you know, you can't necessarily, not in every situation, you can't sit down and explain why this, you know, you want to say this and I want you to do that. It's a case of you go along with their behavior, and that's quite hard for people, you know, because you are denying yourself in that sense. And I think coming to terms with that in yourself, particularly if you're a sort of driving, forceful, go-getter person, you don't take too well to having to submit, if that's not too strong a word. You have to live with the personalities that you've got, though. That's the end line.
For me, the big thing was, I mentioned I'd been living abroad, and I was living in Asia, where sometimes I wasn't quite sure what was going on around me. And particularly when I was teaching English and engineering over there, and you know, you go into someone quite important from Samsung and you have no idea what's going on, and you just have to go with it because you don't want to kind of cause embarrassment to that person or to yourself. And I found that was one of the best things for me to learn with Mum. When something happened a little bit, didn't quite understand what was going on, go along with it, try and work out what's going on from her point of view, what her experience of what we're going through is. So she didn't get embarrassed or feel stupid, because that's what she always felt like. I feel so stupid, I don't understand, or I don't, you know, I'm doing something wrong. Just go along with it. You know, when she was eating her macaroni and cheese with her fingers at one point, I just joined in. And if everyone wants to stare at us, that's fine. That's their problem. And everything was a bit of an adventure, because I never knew quite when I talk about every morning being like stepping out of a TARDIS, and I didn't know where or when we were, because for her, she might be back in time if something had triggered a memory, or she might think we're somewhere else if she's not quite sure where we are. And rather than, you know, as David said, you know, I've told you that, but also the trying to tell her that she's wrong about where we are. What good's that? Does it really matter? Certain times it might do, but majority of the time just go along and have an adventure with her. So we sort of traveled back in time or traveled in places and just enjoy it and don't get hung up on the detail. You know, because we had an adventure. I think they were always the one that really she had more awareness of those. And I sometimes wonder how much of that was because she actually was more accurate talking about when I was 5 or before I was born, or whether it was just that I didn't spot the inaccuracies like I did about what happened last week. I don't know how much of it was that, you know, she actually was more aware of the accuracy back in those days, or just I had no idea. She could tell me all sorts of stories about, you know, that particular photograph, and I wouldn't know the background of it the same way as I did, you know, something that we were looking at from last year. But yeah, she loved to reminisce, but she also wanted to talk about other things, you know, what was going on. And she was always very, very keen on knowing what was going to happen in my life later. Was I going to be okay? I was her only child. You know, I'm single, no children. Was I going to be okay? So she was still my mum, and I talk about it very much. And she'd say to me, "I'm the mum," you know, and we had to make sure that came in. But yeah, I think a lot of it is open mind. Don't keep reminding them of what they're doing wrong, because who of us want that? You know, there might be times you have to correct, but always think about, do you have to? Is it a danger to them? Is it something that's going to cause a problem later on? If it doesn't matter, why do you do it? Just go along with it. Have an adventure.
I do a bit of telephone support as well for 3 or 4 people who got dementia, courtesy of the Alzheimer's Society. They've set it up. It's called Companion Call. And what I try and do over the phone, which is an element in this, it's only an element, because the face-to-face is what really works, because in the face-to-face, you can judge a bit about how the person's feeling, where they're likely to go in the conversation, etc. But over the phone, I do my darndest when I click on a word and I think, oh, he's mentioned that or she's mentioned that before, and get in there and give them a bit of brain exercise by working through on that sort of topic. So it's being sensitive. We're on about this sensitivity, really, aren't we? But we'll go back to what Alison said before, and that's about hope, isn't it? Keeping the hope going, keeping positive.
I mean, opera is in a good position to do this as one of the arts, and that is around touching people's souls and engaging with people's hearts as well as their minds. And I guess that's what people with dementia do, because as our cognitive abilities diminish, often our creative or our emotional engagement with people increases. And if you can get that over to the audience, that would be wonderful as well, because people say as dementia progresses, the person disappears. Well, that's an outsider looking on. That person that you see who used to be as they presented might not quite be presenting in the same way, but it's still the same person. It's still the same father, the mother, the husband, the wife, or whoever, whatever role they had before. It's just that the cognitive abilities of that person are being affected by largely Alzheimer's. But of course, Alzheimer's, remember, is only one of a number of dementias. That's the other thing to not forget. If Kiefer's living with Alzheimer's, well, fair enough. But if he's not in the character living with Alzheimer's but living with another form of dementia, then you might want to consider that. But thinking in terms of Alzheimer's, which of course is the most common one, and me being common, that's what I've got. You know, that's something to consider, because that's something I say to people. You know, looking at balance scales with weights on either side. At one time, I would have been more focused on the cognitive and less focused on the emotional. And what's happened to me in the last 12 years is that's reversed. And now, as my cognitive intelligence has declined, and it has, my emotional intelligence, I guess, hopefully has slightly improved.
Mm.
I'm going to pick up on what Keith's saying, that we get hung up on certain things about people, and we look at what they've lost. And there were some things that Mum couldn't do. She was a really keen gardener, and she lost some of her abilities around gardening. I mean, she could still teach me how to take cuttings right up towards the last few months. And then she went downhill quite quickly at the end. But even in the last months, I say we lost her early March. She got lots of bulbs given her for Christmas, and she was bedbound. And we planted up we had a little table over her bed, and we planted up these bulbs. And even her last week, I'd go in, and she'd have her fingers in the soil of these bulbs. So that love of the soil hadn't gone, and you know, and she kind of wave her dirty fingernails at me, because that was my mum. Yeah, I'm not going to show you my nails either, but we always have dirty fingernails, you know, and it's just something because we love being attached to the ground. But the other thing people get hung up on is the labels that we have. So quite a long time before we lost her, I could never be sure that she would remember that I was Jane or daughter. Those labels had gone. But in her heart, she knew I was someone that she could trust and care about, and that cared about her. So I used to help run a local carers group, and I'd be there helping out, you know, with the activities and things. And I knew that, you know, keep an eye on Mum, but sometimes she'd get a little bit, you could see the head go up, and she was in a wheelchair at that point because her hip was bad, of, oh, where am I and why am I here? And she'd look around and she'd spot me, and then she'd relax. And even though she probably wouldn't be able to tell anyone that's Jane and that's my daughter, she knew that there was a link there somehow. But the other thing, that I was talking to someone the other day, and I was saying even on the last day, when I was obviously quite upset, I knew we're probably going to lose her, she put her hand up and she stroked my hair. And that's something she did from right when I was a tiny child. I would sit next to her knee and put my head on her lap, and she'd just stroke my hair. So somewhere at that point, my mum was still in there, knowing that I was upset and knowing what to do for me.
Yeah.